Michelle, can you also bring up the survey at some point? The student survey?
Me?
Yes. Along with a $20 gift card offer.
Oh, just bring it up. I thought you meant put it on the
No.
screen. Yes, I will do that in the announcements. And then are we just going to put it in the chat?
I guess we could just put it in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know
Thank
if
you for
Melissa can
reminding me.
throw up like a quick page or something. Melissa, do you have the link?
I do not. So if you can just
Yes, I will do so. Hold on.
Send it to me. I can have it ready to share.
Excellent. Thank you.
The gift card is for Walmart?
I'm saying it's from Amazon, but wherever the person wants. $20 gift card to wherever.
Be careful with that wherever.
You're right.
Let's just say Amazon.
Let's just say Amazon unless someone has very strong objections to it.
Do we only want students filling out the survey or
yes,
anyone?
Students and parents.
Students and parents. Okay.
Oh, and Michelle is reminding us that we should be texting all this at this point. Thank you, Michelle.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to come to our town hall. We are the Baltimore County Youth and Justice Advocates United, and we are very passionate about children going to police-free schools, for children being completely free and being in spaces where they're there to learn and not have police in those spaces with them. So we have a panel here today. We're very excited that you all are here to join us and to learn more about this subject and to learn more about how to get connected to what we're doing. So as you can see, that there is a flyer up with our contact information. You can follow us on Instagram, you can follow us on Facebook. We have our email posted as well. If there are any students or parents in the audience who feel like you have a story or something that you want to share about an incident or anything that happened between your family and SROs, please feel free to reach out to us. Also, the last half hour of the town hall will be free for people to ask questions, or if there's something that you would like to share, I want you all to know that this is a safe space, and you are free to share any insights or experiences during that time. If you don't feel comfortable sharing at this time, please reach out to us on social media or through our email. And if you want to put it in the chat, your information, if you want us to reach out to you, please feel free to do that as well, because we definitely want to be connecting with anyone who has a story to tell or yeah, wants to talk about their experiences with SROs in the Baltimore County schools. So we're gonna go ahead and move to our mission statement. Oh, real quick, before we do that, we do have a survey. I just want to make an announcement. We do have a survey that we're asking students and parents to complete. We're going to put the link for that in the chat. One of the people who filled out the survey, one of the lucky winners will be getting a $20 Amazon gift card. So if you could take the time, if you want to do it right now while you're listening, but if you really could take the time to fill out that survey, that would help us a lot in the work that we're doing. So yeah, that's the student survey. If you have any questions about it, feel free to put that in the chat. Any questions that you have, period, the last 30 minutes, we will be taking questions. So as the conversation is going on, if you think of something, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll try to get to your questions during the last 30 minutes. All right, we'll move on to the mission statement.
Is it showing, Michelle?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'm just trying to move my chat. So we are a very new organization, but we are the Baltimore County Youth and Justice Advocates United. We're a grassroots youth center coalition of community members. Sorry, one second. Cannot see the whole thing. Sorry, y'all, my screen's acting up. OMG. Yeah, if you could scroll it up for me. For Melissa, for some reason, my
Sorry, no, I'm trying to make it smaller. My apologies. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I should have had it in front of me and I forgot to do that.
It's okay. I should be making it. Okay, let me see.
Thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
No, it's no problem. So once again, we're the Baltimore County Youth and Justice Advocates United. We're a grassroots youth-centered coalition of community members who are committed to the work of removing police from schools and decriminalizing students. So at this time, we're going to move to our two student members, and they are going to be sharing about the beginnings of our organization and just kind of sharing a little bit more about the reasons why they personally feel that SRO should not be in school, since they are students here in Baltimore County, and just give a little bit more information about how we got started. So at this point, I will turn the floor over to Nusrat and Beth.
Thank you so much, Michelle. The way Baltimore County Youth and Justice Advocates United started was, as some of you may recognize, Beth and I from Catonsville Youth United. Hold on, sorry, Catonsville Youth for Black Lives Matter, and Michelle, Kim, and Tiara and Rachel are all juvenile public defenders who reached out to Beth and I and some other young women to get a push for what is really going on with the presence of school police and their impact on students and the learning environment. As Catonsville for Black Lives Matters, one of the demands we presented is that we wanted school police out of the presence. We didn't want their presence in school anymore. So to me, it honestly signifies how much of an impact school police have on not just the mental health, but also the stereotyping of students of color when there is someone of the police force present within a place which they are supposed to feel safe and in a place where they're supposed to learn. And for juvenile public defenders to come forward and want to raise awareness on this issue really signifies that one of the main reasons for which young people children are brought into the justice system is in the way that they are dealt with and marginalized by the police force within their school.
I don't know how I'm going to top that, but similar to what Nusrat said, I think that one of the main reasons why a big focus of a lot of my activism is towards pushing police out of our schools is busting the school to prison pipeline. And statistically speaking, we can see that as a result of over policing in schools as opposed to counseling and rehabilitation, we have seen more and more students of color, specifically Black students, being vented right into the juvenile system, and then from there on to the larger adult incarceration system. And I think that although SROs were good in theory and something that can provide comfort to white students, for Black students and other students of color, it can often be a sign or a reminder of what they may not amount to, or that they are criminal, or that they fulfill any type of stereotype that is put in place on them by staff in the educational environment. It can have a variety of effects on how a student views themselves, both their self-worth and both how successful or not successful they may be in life when they're treated as a criminal from an age as early as 5. So I think that is why this is such a big thing for us. And I think as a youth activist, using every platform that each of us have, and a lot of the young people who are watching this now, that your voice is really significant and can accomplish more things that you can even imagine. Even us being able to work with public defenders was something that I may not have ever imagined a year ago. And look now. And the thing is that as we are moving up in the world, and as we are going to college, and as we are moving into life, we have to recognize that the decisions we make now and the action that we take now has such long-lasting and significant effects into each of our futures. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth and Nusrat. That was really well said. My first question to you all was going to be, why do you think police should be removed from schools? But you both answered that very eloquently. So my second question to you all is, if police were removed from schools, how would you like to see those resources reallocated? Nusrat, did you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Michelle. One of the main things that comes on the offense of why school police are there is an aspect of safety, but I personally have seen the abuse of using police officers in an abusive way to discipline children for like very much minor things like talking back to the teacher, showing up late, or even unfortunately, everyone has implicit biases, and in schools, teachers usually have intentionally or unintentionally have this group of children who most of the time are struggling with various things in the household and cannot as much be active in the school environment as other students, which then puts them in this circle of kids that the teachers almost target and have an unfavor of and towards. So then when they lash out per se or do something that the teachers don't favor, the SRO is immediately called, when in fact it could be dealt with a counselor, which I think the funds could be reallocated to, is towards counselors. And police officers are also there for the necessity of like breaking up fights, which obviously teachers don't or need to necessarily get involved with. But I don't think someone who is armed needs to be doing that. Like there's no necessity for weaponry, and the funds could also be allocated to hiring someone who is not a part of law enforcement, but someone who is like a security guard and like a part of the staff instead of being a part of law enforcement, to do such simple things that are quote unquote associated with violence.
I agree. And I also think that when we introduce counselors and we use those funds to train teachers with like de-escalation techniques and giving them the resources to academically support children who are struggling, that will lessen the need for SROs because we won't see as much like behavioral disputes or anything like that when children are given the support they need and not treated like felons. And I also think that as we begin to like push for this change and as we begin to see funds, in this case, if we see funds start being reallocated into schools, we'll also see the overall school environment change from like a vulnerable space susceptible to people feeling upset and hurt already before they even walk into the school building to create a welcoming space where students feel a good relationship with the staff rather than feeling as if the staff is going to attack them. And then Maryland doesn't even meet the recommendation from the US Department of Education of the counselor to student ratio. And that in itself is something that needs to be addressed and can also be tied into the reasons why we see these funds going to constant SROs in schools that are usually predominantly Black.
Thank you so much, Beth and Meseret. I think you guys hit on an important piece about de-escalation, right? That like these are issues that could be handled by someone other than a police officer with a gun, and who automatically, their very presence a lot of times does escalate things, unfortunately. So thank you for touching on that. And I just wanted to add quickly that like Beth was saying, that in Maryland, most schools are actually sharing psychologists, right? Like most schools in Maryland don't even have one psychologist to each building, but our high schools in Maryland a lot of times have 2 SROs. So we're talking about schools are sharing a psychologist but have 2 SROs. Like, you know, we have to look at those statistics when we're talking about this. If Beth and Nusra, if you guys don't have anything else, we'll move on. Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to Michelle Kim. She's going to be sharing a video and a story about one of her clients.
Actually, I think Megan's client we're going to feature Megan's client, if that's okay. So
Sure.
I'm going to pass the baton over to Megan.
Sure. Megan, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm an attorney at Disability Rights Maryland, and I represent students in school discipline cases and special education matters across the state. And this issue, removing police from schools, is really important to me because through my work representing students and working with students and families, I've seen the very sort of traumatic and devastating effects that school police have on students. And as we know, school police disproportionately arrest students of color and students with disabilities, and the statistics in Baltimore County Public Schools is really alarming. And so I want to share a video clip of one of my clients, a Baltimore County public school student, a middle school student who last year at the beginning of 2019 was restrained by a school resource officer and was injured. And so I just want to caution everyone that the video will show police violence and use of force. So it's a short video, but I think it's important and it demonstrates the real harm that police in schools can cause.
Melissa, we can't hear the audio.
So in 2019, when he was Rome liaison, now 12, has been diagnosed with autism. So in 2019, when he was moving to middle school, his aunt and guardian carefully looked for a school that could meet his needs. General John Stripper Middle School was the choice.
And they told us that they could meet his needs, so that's why we chose that school. You have to have a behavior plan for autistic children because, you know, they act out in different ways than other children.
Just a few days into the school year, Jerome got into an argument with another student after he felt he was bullied. As a school employee took him to the office, he ran and then was taken to what's called a focus room.
Hi. Calm down.
A staff member reported Jerome was banging his head against the wall. Initially, he was restrained by a staff member holding him. But about 2 minutes later, the decision was made to handcuff Jerome by the school resource officer. This video is from the officer's body-worn camera. Jerome resisted, cursing, kicking, and crying. The handcuffs remained in place for about 23 minutes. His aunt believes it was an unnecessary use of force.
It was terrible. They treated him like a criminal, and he's only an autistic little boy.
A spokesperson for the Baltimore County school system defended the officer's response, saying in a statement, physical restraint is allowed when necessary to protect a student or another person from imminent serious physical harm after other less intrusive non-physical interventions have failed. The statement went on, police are called for support in emergency situations, and their response is dictated by county police best practices. County police refer to their use of force policy, which applies the same criteria to school resource officers. Handcuff restraint permitted to prevent someone from harming themselves or others. Sam Pulver is the family's lawyer.
And what we see in this video and what happened is just a complete systemic failure from, start to finish about the appropriate way to deal with Jerome in this setting. The cherry on top being that a cop came in and put him in handcuffs, which is just under no circumstances would that ever been allowed to take place.
During the incident, Jerome complained of injury to his arm. The following day, he was treated for a broken bone in his right wrist. And to this day, his aunt says, Jerome is afraid of police.
If we go to Walmart or somewhere like that, Jerome stays in the car with my husband because he's afraid to even walk past police officers.
The family also argues that the school failed to follow Jerome's individual education plan, its IEP, in de-escalating the incident. The family lawyer says a lawsuit is likely to be filed. Reporting live tonight in Dundalk, I'm Jane Miller, WBAL TV 11 News.
And so I think what I want to just talk about a little bit is what happened before the SRO and the school police officer intervened. So I was representing Jerome in his education matters, and so I was able to see the video. And what happened before was that he had left his classroom. He had eloped from his classroom and had gone to an empty classroom. So he was standing in an empty classroom, refusing to go back to school. And there was a behavior interventionist, and she radioed to the school resource officer for assistance. And so, and that's how the school police officer got involved, because the school, the school staff person had radioed and sort of called in for support from the school resource officer. And I think one of the things that that we see, and that the evidence demonstrates, is that the mere presence of police officers in schools ends up criminalizing everyday student behaviors, disability-related behaviors. It ends up criminalizing minor behaviors and criminalizes school discipline. And when school resource officers and police officers are in the schools, very often school administrators and school staff are going to default to calling them in. So what very often could be resolved in sort of a teaching moment with the teacher or the administrator taking the time, it's just a default. The police officers in the building, they radio, then the police officer comes in, and the primary tool of the police officer is to sort of identify criminal behavior and arrest. And then what we see is the funneling of students into the school to prison pipeline. So I think, the video shows the real harm, but it's also important to understand what's happening before that. It's just everyday misbehavior, everyday behavior from kids that ends up being criminalized.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. And now we will move to Michelle Kim, who will be talking about one of her clients.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who's already shared. I think that what's important to recognize is that what happened with Jerome and what Nusrat and Beth have described are not unprecedented or rare occurrences, right? As I'm a juvenile public defender in Baltimore County, these are things that we see on a pretty frequent basis. Because we work in the juvenile courts, we see very directly that schools are a feeder to the not only the juvenile prosecution system, but ultimately to the adult criminal system and to prison. The case that Megan was talking about, a child with autism who left his classroom because he had some kind of emotional upset, that seems like a pretty ordinary occurrence that can be easily handled within the realm of ordinary school discipline. But because of school police, we ramp it up to something that is prosecutable. And I don't think that's a word, but I'm going to use it anyway. There is a statute called Disrupting School Activities. And I'm actually going to read the statute to everybody. It says, a person may not willfully disturb or otherwise willfully prevent the orderly conduct of the activities, administration, or classes of any institution of elementary, secondary, or higher education. And if you think about that language, so many school behaviors, so many kid behaviors fall within that umbrella. And what we see here is that's exactly the case. The majority of school-based arrests in Baltimore County were not for things like crimes of violence or crimes that required some kind of intervention to keep other students or staff safe. It was for disrespect and for disruption. So it was for things like this. And what ends up happening is not only do these children get prosecuted, they get placed on some kind of court-ordered supervision. They get placed on these kinds of records and databases. Juvenile records are not erased or completely private. As juvenile public defenders and defense attorneys know, there are ways that the public can access those records, and that leads to a system in which we're criminalizing very much child behaviors and everyday behaviors. And that's exacerbated by the presence of school police. Just as a few more examples on top of Megan's, and I'm going to kind of move on, I've had clients who were charged with disrupting school activities for brushing past a teacher to get to the bathroom. I've had students as young as 11 who have been charged with getting into a school fight or arguing with their teachers. One of my colleagues, Tiara Hawks, had a client who was 11 years old and also had a disability, who was having some kind of emotional upheaval and got a traffic cone and was hitting the assistant principal's car with the kind of floppy part of the traffic cone, and was charged with destruction of property and disrupting school activities. And it's so obvious from the video how inadequate the police response is, because it's an 11-year-old tiny little boy who's running around like holding the traffic cone on his head, and the police officer is just completely unequipped to actually calm the child down and handle the situation as is developmentally appropriate. So none of these things that we're talking about is rare or the worst case scenario at all.
Thank you, Michelle. Were you still going to share a video, Michelle, or no?
So we have that video from the parent. I don't know if Melissa has it on deck, but that's not, yes, that's from just a parent of a child. That's not from my client.
Did you want us to share it, or?
Yes, we can share.
Okay, all right.
sorry, my firm belief is, in urban communities, or let me just, not sweeten it up. In the African American communities, I think sometimes when there are police officers of other races, they aren't always fair. I don't think that African American children get the breaks or the understanding or the benefit of the doubt sometimes that children of other races do. So I think that, even though a police officer should be in the school, it should be one that is familiar with the process, that wants to better the children, that wants to see them be better, that want to help them with the problem they may be having at home or in school with drugs. Or, some of these kids come from households that are miserable and they bring it right to school. And if you have an officer that all he wants to do is lock you up, then how does that benefit the child at all? Ask a question, get to know them.
Go ahead.
Thank
Do you
you.
have something to add, Michelle?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. So at this point, we're going to move to our panel. Thank you so much for our panel for being available to help share in, sharing with the community why we think it's so important to have SROs removed from schools. At this moment, we'll have the panel introduce themselves. If you all could share the work that you do that brought you to this space and feeling that police should be removed from schools, your pronouns, and where you went to high school. And we'll go ahead and do that now. Michelle Hall, would you like to go first?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Hall. I am a juvenile public defender with the Office of the Public Defender. I work in Prince George's County, but I'm also working to help support our statewide efforts to remove police officers from school. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I grew up in Annapolis, and I went to Archbishop Spalding, so a Catholic high school for high school. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Michelle. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself again since you're a panel member?
Sure. Megan Berger, I'm with Disability Rights Maryland. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I grew up in Howard County.
Thank you. Michelle, Kim, and Tiara Hawks, did you all want to introduce yourselves as part of the panel?
Sure. Again, my name is Michelle Kim. I'm a juvenile public defender in Baltimore County. I'm actually from Orange County, California, so I went to Woodbridge High School, and my pronouns are she, her, hers as well.
Tiara.
Hello, my name is Tiara Hawks. I'm also a juvenile public defender in Baltimore County. I'm a new public defender, so I've been learning a lot within these last couple of months. I started during COVID, so it's been great. And so I attended Towson High School, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you again to the panel. So my first question to the panel is if you could get more into detail about how the work that you do, Michelle Kim kind of already touched on this, but if you all could share some more detail about how the work you do on an everyday basis has brought you to the conclusion that police should be removed from schools and it does not make schools safer for children. Megan Berger, would you like to go first?
Sure. So it's really my work with students and families across the state in special education and school discipline cases. As I sort of talked about through my work with Jerome, I have seen firsthand, and I have worked with many students who have been handcuffed, arrested, restrained, or have otherwise had a really negative traumatic experience with school police. And it's that sort of, talking with the students and their families and hearing about the harm and the devastation that it often, causes not only to the student, but also sometimes to their whole family to have this sort of traumatic event happen. And then, for the students that are arrested, they're then in the juvenile or criminal justice system and all of the missed school and everything that goes along with being in that process that I know, Michelle could speak to as well. but it's really just seeing the direct harms and looking at the data. You know, in Baltimore County, students with disabilities with IEPs received 29% of school-based arrests, despite comprising 14% of the student population. So that disproportionality is just so evident and so clear. And there is, you know, similar disproportionality for Black students and students of color, and you know, and I can let other panelists speak to that data, but the data is just really, really clear that school police do not keep schools safe. They don't prevent school shootings. They don't make schools safer, but what they do is that they harm sort of students with disabilities and students of color and criminalize school discipline. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I think it's such a critical, important issue that we really have to all sort of come together to work forward to fix.
Thank you so much, Megan. Michelle Hall, would you like to go next? Do you have anything to add to what Megan said?
Sure. I mean, I think the only thing that I would add is that the unfortunate reality of my work is that so many of my clients would never have become my clients if there were not police in schools. One of the threads that has really come out really clearly tonight, and that I'm really happy has been emphasized, is over-reliance. And the fact that we have an officer present in the school means that that is just your gut reaction, and that is where you are automatically going to for things that, you know, when I was in school would not have amounted to a police officer being called and being arrested and you being prosecuted. I think sometimes when I talk about my work with other people, they're really shocked by the types of things that Michelle Kim talked about and that Megan has talked about as well, that kids are arrested for and are prosecuted for overall. And so I just know it's so abundantly clear to me that if police were not in schools, that children would not be having these experiences. But also, it's important to point out that having a police officer in your school really fundamentally breaks what school is supposed to be for. School and really adolescence is about growing and making mistakes, and having people there to support you so that you can make those mistakes and grow and learn from them. I know when I was a teenager, I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes at school. And if I had not felt that I was safe in school, or really if I had been prosecuted for making those types of mistakes, I wouldn't be sitting on this panel today. And I think that when we have police officers in schools, we have the threat of an armed police officer in school, that really breaks down that child's ability to be able to go to school and have that be a safe space. And a lot of my clients, even if they're not coming to me because of a school-based offense, you know, a typical part of any probation order is go obey all rules, obey all laws, and go to school, attend school daily, and apply yourself. It's really hard to apply yourself in school when you are constantly being policed and you know that there's an officer there. Maybe they're familiar with your case. If it wasn't a school-based case, they're the officer that arrested you for something that you really shouldn't have been arrested for. That can fundamentally break the relationship that you have with school. And so for all of those reasons, I just think it's incredibly important that we make schools a safe place for students to learn and not to be policed and criminalized.
Thank you so much, Michelle Hall. That was so well said. Michelle Kim, do you have anything to add?
So I'm just going to be really brief, and I agree with everything that Michelle Hall is saying. Just to the point about how police officers in schools have taken on the mentorship roles and things like that, I do want to address that because we see the reality of what actually happens in the classroom. I have no doubt that there are some really kind, good-hearted police in schools, but that's not kind of what we're talking about in terms of the structural issues about having armed police in places of education and nurturing. What happens in the courtroom is when a kid gets prosecuted for disrupting school activities, or another common category would be school fights, is that school police officer and those teachers come to court to testify against the student. And it's such a fundamental breach of that trust, of that relationship, that teacher-student kind of adult-kid relationship. You can just see the hurt on our kids' faces when their assistant principal comes walking into that courtroom and sits on that witness stand to testify against the student. I had a case just the other day where my client was charged with a school fight because he got into a fight with another kid who had been harassing him all school year, and finally, you know, got in a fight with him. And the school resource officer was telling both the state's attorney and I, this kid has been doing really wonderfully this year. He's really stepped up his game. Like, he really works well and has been on the football team. And is dedicated to kind of really getting his act together. But by the end of the trial and by the end of that court session, my kid didn't want to talk to that school police officer anymore. And that relationship was probably irretrievably shattered because they're working at cross purposes. You can't at one time nurture someone and also, use coercion against them and the threat of prosecution against them. It just doesn't work hand in hand. And those conversations that kids will have in confidence with teachers and with staff and with school police, if that gets used as a weapon against them in these forums, that really just shows that we've fundamentally transformed schoolrooms into something else entirely.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really like the point that you made about how that we're not attacking individual SROs in doing this work. That's what I hear so much from people. Like, we love our, the SRO at our school. And no one is taking away from that. And no one is saying that these are evil people. We are talking about institutional situation, institutional thing that is set up that goes outside of the school, and like Michelle Kim said, it goes into the courtrooms. And so we just want to make that clear that we're not attacking individual SROs. That is not our purpose here today. Okay, next question for the panel. I feel like we already touched on this, but I don't know if anyone wanted to add any specific statistics to it. But how does the presence of police in schools contribute directly to the school to prison pipeline? I know we kind of we've mentioned it so far tonight, but I didn't know if anyone wanted to add to that point or elaborate on that at all.
I think we've really covered a lot of it, and I would just say, and I would really point everyone, and I can put it in the chat, to the Maryland Commission on the School to Prison Pipeline. They issued a report at the end of 2018 that I think does a fantastic job of laying out where the breakdowns are in our education system, not just with respect to school police officers, but overall that are funneling kids into the school to prison pipeline. But there are numerous studies out there that show that, if you have police officers in your schools, ultimately what you have is criminalization and over-criminalization of what is typical adolescent behavior, what is misdemeanor behavior, and things that quite simply should not be prosecuted. I would also, push everyone to familiarize themselves with the arrest data from the Maryland State Department of Education. And we touched on this a little bit before, but I just want to say that in the 2018-2019 school year, there were 259 arrests in Baltimore County. 51 of those were for disruption and 14 of those were disrespect. So that amounts to 25% of the arrests in Baltimore County was for disruption and disrespect. So if you're talking back to your teacher, if you're brushing past the teacher to go to the bathroom, as Michelle Kim said, right? Those are the types of things, 25%, a quarter of the arrests. And then on top of that, the other, we also had 14 arrests for theft, 16 for trespassing, 13 for destruction of property. And what it comes out to is 42% of the arrests in Baltimore County were for these types of non-violent misdemeanors that really are things that I think kids in memoriam have done. And so I will provide the links to both the Commission on the Commission's report, as well as the State Department of Education's data. But it is just abundantly clear that the types of things that we are arresting kids for is not behavior that I think anyone would want any of their children to be in court for.
I'll just add, I was just going to say one other sort of alarming statistic, I think, is that 32% of school-based arrests in Baltimore County Public Schools were of elementary and middle school students, 32%. So that's just really alarming.
Very alarming. Thank you, Megan. If no one else has anything to add, I'll move on to the next question. Once again, I feel like this is something we kind of already touched on, but if anyone has anything they want to elaborate or add to this point, what are some of the negative effects that the presence of police in schools have specifically on Black and Brown children?
So again, in looking at the Commission's report, and if you want to follow along, since I just dropped it, it's on page 29. In the 2015-2016 school year in Maryland, Black students were 34% of overall enrollment, but 66% of the children arrested. And as the report goes on to detail, that's not because Black students are more involved in delinquent behavior and behavior that legitimizes arrest. That comes from exclusionary discipline that is applied inconsistently and inequitably across schools. And so really that's coming from bias from administrators, from police officers who are in school who are referring Black students, over-referring Black students for exclusionary discipline and also arrest as well. I would also point out, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and the impact that is having on the experiences of Black children in schools. And I think it is certainly, and I know that my clients speak to this often, the impact of what we see with policing in general, even in this state, and the excessive force that we see from officers routinely, and the concern that that can be replicated and is replicated, as we saw in the video of Megan's client, and we see really across the country towards students, and how that is disproportionately applied towards Black students as well, Black and brown students. And so, again, I think that there is just such a breakdown in your relationship with school when you have the risk and the reality of being policed in school, oftentimes over policed because you're Black and brown.
Thank you so much, Michelle Hall. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add?
I'll just jump in really quickly, and actually I'm going to put Beth and Nusrat on the spot a little bit because they're from Catonsville High School, which I don't think has a majority Black and brown student population, but just down the street is Lansdowne, and it's just so stark in terms of how these different schools are treated, right? Lansdowne High and Lansdowne Middle, which is a little bit shocking, are always within our kind of top 5 schools in terms of arrests. They have a robust school resource officer presence. We're constantly hearing from them. We're constantly getting cases from them. And then on the flip side, maybe a couple miles away, maybe not even that, is Catonsville, probably a majority white school, much wealthier, and they don't have these issues at all. So I'm gonna let Beth and Nusrat talk a little bit about that, but I think more than anything, that shows that there is disparate enforcement and disparate presence.
Definitely. And I think that attests to policing even outside of schools, that we see that in predominantly Black communities, we see over policing for reasons that can be dated all the way back to just systemic racism. And with this, when we can even go to Woodlawn, all of these schools, Lansdowne, Woodlawn, and Catonsville High School being 20 minutes away from each other at most. Woodlawn being a predominantly Black school closer to the city, and Catonsville High School being a predominantly white school in an affluent area where all the families have connections to each other, et cetera. And we can see that although the schools are so close to each other and in a similar proximity to the city, we can see that Catonsville High School only has one SRO, and we have an in-school psychologist. We have guidance counselors, more than one, that can be divided up by grade level and last name. And we have the support that can provide us with the success that we can take into the world. But schools like Woodlawn and Lansdowne are faced with over-policing that can discourage students and lead them to feel excluded from school, which can attribute to academic failure, mental health problems, substance abuse, gang activity, and just overall a complete line that can be pushing them straight into the juvenile system. And it's not that they have more behavioral outbursts. It's that they are held to a different standard and more harsher punishments are imposed onto them. And very minor offenses, like Michelle Hall mentioned before, very minor offenses can land them in a courtroom, as opposed to Catonsville, where minor things get brushed off. And it comes to a point where, like Michelle Kim, you said, we're not at all attacking SROs, because they can be nice people, but sometimes we have to recognize that a smile in the hallway and a pat on the back at lunch and being arrested in the middle of English class are two very different things, and one very clearly outweighs the other.
Yeah, everything Beth has mentioned, I couldn't have put it into better words. But one other thing is especially right now with the America's Great Awakening and the youth being so highly involved in what is going on, and including the Black Lives Matter movement, and a kind of fear towards police officers. So as a student of color, even though you've never interacted or spoken to this police officer in your school, just their presence and that as small as it may be, that possibility of some wrong interaction occurring between you and that police officer can within itself be so traumatizing. Even if you're the best student, most well behaved, your skin color is, whether, I'm not saying it's a person to person thing, but it's almost systemic, where your skin color is weaponized and something you simply can't control. So I think just that presence aspect as students of color, we've definitely seen how that plays onto the students' mentality and how they perceive themselves and how society deems them within a space.
Thank you both so much for adding to the conversation. You guys are so intelligent and well-spoken. I'm loving it. So we're going to move on to the next question. So a lot of times we hear the argument when we talk about removing SROs from schools. A lot of people come back with the argument about school shootings. That's usually a very common retort. And so I just want to ask the panel, why do you all think that this may or may not be a good or valid argument against removing police from schools?
Okay, I'll go first. So I think, first of all, one thing that we really need to ground ourselves in is the history of school police, and recognize that school police did not just come about at Columbine. And I think a lot of times we want to talk about it as if that's the case, but that's not the truth of the matter. The Advancement Project has this fantastic report called Dignity in School. We Came to Learn, which really does a super detailed history of how police ended up in our schools. And quite frankly, police were introduced in our schools at the time of integration because Black students were being integrated into schools with white students, and as a way to police and surveil Black students. And so I think we need to first have an honest conversation that the genesis of police in our schools is not directly one-to-one linked with school shootings. But the fact of the matter is school shootings are a reality of our world at this point. And as Megan Berger said earlier, there's no documented instance of school police stopping a school shooting. That just simply isn't the case. There isn't the data to support it, and there isn't data to show the ways that police being present in schools has decreased school shootings or violence. What there is a lot of data about is the harm that police in schools is causing. And I also push back on this often by saying that if this were the case, that we have to have armed police officers in our schools in order to stop a school shooting, we would have armed police in every single school. And that is not the case. Even in Baltimore County, which, as I'm looking at the statistics, has a lot of armed police officers in your schools. If you look at the elementary school data, and the Maryland Center for School Safety publishes an overview of what the law enforcement coverage is of every county throughout the state. And there, of 108 elementary schools that are in the county, there are only 10 primarily assigned SROs. So what that means functionally is that there are elementary schools every single day that do not have an armed police officer present. And so I think we have to be honest that That isn't the role that armed police officers are serving. There isn't any data to support that they are, stopping school shootings, that they are decreasing violence, and that really what we're seeing is a negative impact by having them in schools. And I will also, I have to find this link, but I will also provide the information for the Maryland Center for School Safety as well.
Thank you so much, Michelle Hall. I had no idea. I've been doing research on this, and I had no idea that it was police and schools was linked to integration. So thank you. I didn't know that. If anyone doesn't have anything else to add to that question, I'll move on to the next one. Okay. So the last question I have for the panel is, when we have these conversations about moving SROs from schools, people get really passionate about it, and there's a lot of pushback. In your opinion, in doing this work, what do you all think, I guess two-part question, what do you think the reason is that people feel so passionately about having SROs in schools despite the wealth of information that we have about how detrimental it is, especially to children who have disabilities and children of color? And what do you all think that can be done as a community to combat that?
I can start. I think part of it is there is a perception, because it's sort of been built up, through the media and over the years, that there's a perception that school police keep schools safe, and that they are going to protect against a school shooting. And that's the perception. But I think when you start looking at the research and reading, looking at the research, and sort of the evidence shows that there is no empirical evidence, there's no reliable evidence that they are keeping schools safe. And as Michelle said, there is a lot of evidence that they're doing harm, that we have to do town halls just like this and sort of educating and having these conversations about school police and the real impacts of them, and looking at the statistics and looking at the numbers, so that people aren't making decisions out of fear or sort of a perception that they're gonna keep schools safe.
I think that's exactly right. And the thing that I would add, and I should have said this in the beginning of the panel, is one thing that I have been advocating for, and others have been advocating for as well, is to stop using the term SRO and stop using the term school resource officer, because the reality of what we are talking about is having armed police officers in our schools. And the notion of school resource officers as having resources, I think, makes the reality a lot more palatable, right? And we're not talking about the reality, which is that we are policing our schools in ways that prisons and jails are policed, and that is what we are doing for our children. And as in the commission's report, this is my favorite quote that I always come back to. It says, school resource officers are not trained as educators, but as sworn law enforcement officers with the authority to arrest people. This mindset can have devastating life consequences for students arrested for school discipline matters that do not constitute serious crimes. I don't think until this summer that we were having a robust conversation about what the role was of armed police officers in our schools. And I think the school shootings point is what we often come back to, because that is what a lot of people think armed police officers are doing in our schools. That isn't the case. So much of what they are doing every single day is arresting students, is sending them to court, and is really negatively impacting the relationship that students have with schools. And I think a lot of the pushback, although I would say I think that we are actually having a lot more of a robust conversation, a lot less pushback, because people are seeing the light about what role armed police officers are playing in our schools. But a lot of it comes from just not having that information, not having that knowledge, which is why these types of town halls are so important.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Beth, would you like to add something?
Yeah, and I think that this is also a thing in which a lot of white parents like to attest that they have positive interactions with police in schools. And there's a reason for that, because their children have never been exposed to the trauma that comes with seeing a police officer. And when forced to kind of look in the mirror of systemic racism and realize that it also exists very much in the education system, it's an uncomfortable conversation for them to accept, and it's an uncomfortable pill for them to swallow, to realize that even like officers in schools are not doing what they were meant to do in their eyes. And I think that, once again, trailing back to the fact that this is not a personal attack on any SROs. This is a matter of like endangered students who are POCs walking into a school system that they are expected to be nurtured in, and instead are faced with harsher punishment and are faced with hostility from both staff and those who are meant to protect and serve. And I think that a lot of people don't like to disrupt that white comfort that comes with the idea of police being in schools. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Beth. If there are no other comments from the panel, we're going to move on to the question and answer portion. Okay. All right. Let me go into the Q&A side. So I'm going to start with the questions that you all have already put in, but if there are any other audience members that want to add questions, please feel free to do so now. Okay. How will the legislative effort to remove SROs from schools be worked with the members of the General Assembly? Does anyone on the panel have any knowledge about that?
Well, I think more broadly, removing armed police officers from schools is a part of the broader police reform package that so many of the advocates across the state who have been pushing 5 different police reform steps that they want to see taken in the next legislative session. And so the goal is really still for removing school police officers to be part of that, that package as well. But also there are so many efforts happening on local levels, and so much of this, even though Maryland is not a super huge state, everything is really hyper local and is happening differently in different counties. And so it could very well be the case, even if there isn't a broader legislative step taken statewide, that there is action that can be taken in Baltimore County and other counties across the state that can impact local schools.
I'll just add my 2 cents. So Michelle Hall is exactly right. There's a local effort and a statewide effort. And Michelle Hall is from Prince George's, where there's a lot more going on in terms of development of this conversation. Baltimore County, we're just starting to have this conversation. That's kind of what this town hall is about. So we're really excited to see the kind of questions and comments about like, what can we do? What's the next steps? Because part of the kind of the first step is recognition, right? We just need to get this on the table. We don't have a school board member at the Baltimore County Public School Board who is on kind of willing to advocate for this as of yet. So we need your help in terms of bringing awareness to these players to make sure that they're at least kind of contemplating this conversation. Just to kind of go back to a little bit about what Michelle Dewberry was saying, you know, why is there like this emotional component to having police in schools? A big part of it is that we think that having police in schools is an inevitability. It is not. I didn't go to a high school with an SRO or school police officer. And I think my school experience would have been very different had it had. So we need to kind of expand our boundaries of what is possible. And part of that's going to be having a robust conversation with some stakeholders here about, you know, whether or not police in Baltimore County schools is really necessary.
Thank you, Michelle. Kim. I don't know if this question was answered, Megan. I think this was in reference to your video. Was the behavior interventionist who called an SRO a mental health professional? And I don't know if you know the answer to that or not.
I don't, yeah, I'm not sure sort of what, what sort of her background was, or, you know, any sort of certification or, you know, professional license that she may have had.
Thank you. All right, the next question. Does anyone on the panel have data on how many of the Baltimore County cases are diverted to the JOINS program, a restorative justice program for juvenile first-time misdemeanor offenders in Baltimore County?
So I'll take that. I don't know, Michelle, I have a feeling that's not going to be in the Department of Education data, but I did have a case in which we were arguing that JOINS should be involved. So we can do a MPIA request to see. Definitely there are cases that are diverted to joins. And there's actually a kind of a mandate in a lot of schools that they're supposed to be implementing restorative justice practices in their schools in terms of using mediation and other forms rather than going to the court system. However, that can be waylaid by a number of areas. For example, if the argument is that it's not a misdemeanor, or that the student has had behavioral issues before, or if the complainant does not want that person to participate in joins, or even if the child denies that this happened, if they're claiming that if they're saying that they were innocent. All those reasons are ways in which joins no longer becomes applicable, and the case automatically gets forwarded to the state's attorney's office. So definitely there are a percentage of cases that do go to the joins program. Of course, our argument is going to be it's not nearly enough. And we've seen, because there's like the sheet that they have to fill out as to why joins was denied. And we see all the time those denials coming in.
The other thing that I would add is, I think one thing that's really interesting that I've been learning diving into this work is like there's a lot of things that is really unclear in the data. So I think that there's like a disconnect between, I would imagine that the data that the MSD provides is not inclusive of every contact, every school-based police contact. And so it may be that there are far more school-based police contacts, and we're cutting off at the top, and those cases are being diverted and sent to joins or another diversion type program. And then we have arrests. It may be that the arrest data is inclusive of some joins cases. It's really hard to say. And then on the Department of Juvenile Services end, there isn't a lot of clarity on this is the number of cases because, and it's kind of like convoluted procedural stuff, but it isn't a direct line between an arrest in school and you are in court. There's a couple of other steps along the way that are different than adult court, but there is kind of a disconnect of the number of cases that are ultimately being prosecuted in any particular county that are coming from schools. But one thing that I would also say about diversion, and obviously I think diversion is incredibly important. We need less children involved in any type of justice system at all. But it is important to recognize that even diversion includes a type of police contact, right? It includes some state figure saying that you, child, need some type of service for this particular conduct. And there's a lot of conduct that is not the case. I don't think, and you know, I can't speak to like what the rest of the panel feels about this, but I don't think that every single school fight mandates that you need to do some type of programming, because I think it is often a reality of adolescence that kids fight, and so I do think obviously I want to push, in Prince George's County, I would love to see more use of diversion and more helpful use of diversion here. And I think statewide, that's something that we want to see as well. But I think while we're rethinking what policing in schools looks like or should not look like, we also need to rethink what any police contact and how we can minimize police contact overall. And that does include diversion, because sometimes I think there are a lot of cases that we think of as diversion cases that shouldn't be involved at all. There's a lot of cases that are court cases that should be diverted. And that's really, we need to be ratcheting back so much in that respect.
Thank you, Michelle Hall. Okay, we have a question from a Baltimore County parent that wants to know how he can get involved in the work that we're doing here. And I'm just going to say that we are going to have the slide back up at the end with all of our social media and our email address. So please, if you're interested in supporting this effort, follow us on social media, shoot us an email. Like I said before, we're very new as an organization, but so we're still trying to figure out how we're going to galvanize our support. But just please stay connected to us on social media.
But I also think one of the most helpful things that you can do across the board is educate yourself as much as possible with the resources that we've put out there. And I hope that you guys in the follow-up email send even more reports and things. Because I do think being able to have that conversation with other parents, with other people in the community, about this being an important issue is something that is really going to continue to move the ball and move the lever, because like we've been saying, right, I mean, like Michelle Dewberry said, right, I didn't know that so much of school policing started at integration. And those are the types of conversations and information that we need to be spreading across the board, so that we're having a conversation that is based in facts and not based in emotions and fear. And so I would also say, while this is a nascent group and while the movement in Baltimore County is ramping up, that is an important thing that you can do so that you can contribute as the movement continues forward.
Thank you for that, Michelle Hall.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would add is I've been really surprised at how willing and open legislators and other policymakers are from hearing from kind of everyday people. So I would encourage everyone, and I know we have a comment in the chat as well from Christina Simmons, who's asking, what are the next steps to removing armed police? How can people who are not students or parents? So whether you're a student, you're a parent, or you're just a concerned citizen, reaching out to your legislator, your delegate, your senator, and saying, like, this is something that I want to talk about. Because what's been a little bit surprising about the response we've been getting is, this is the first time I've heard about it. All I hear is are good things about school police and how parents want police in schools. So even having this conversation about how, like, we need to have a discussion about this, I think is a really, really important place to start. And like Michelle Hall was saying, if you come at them with like fiery statistics and you talk to them about the history of school police, and you even talk to them about maybe your friends or your child's experience, all the better. So let's start there. Let's raise awareness and then kind of build these bridges towards action.
Thank you, Michelle Kim. So we have a question. Is it true that Baltimore City Public Schools do not have armed police officers? If so, do you know how this came to be? I'm not sure if anyone on the panel has any information about Baltimore City.
Well, Baltimore City is kind of operating in an entirely different way, because they have a school-specific police force, which is obviously like a whole different can of worms. And the structure that most counties have, right, is that there's these memorandums of understanding between the local police department and the school system. And so that is what the functional relationship is like between the armed police officers that are in schools and the school system. I will say, Prince George's County, we have a kind of hybrid. We have armed SR school resource officers, armed police officers who are contracted to schools through MOUs. Then under that, we have what are called investigative counselors, who are police officers who are in schools but don't have a weapon, but do have the ability to arrest and do a lot of arrests in schools. And then even under that, we have school security, who are playing that security type of role, but they aren't police officers. And so that obviously comes with its own set of issues as we talk about what policing should or should not be in schools. Is the thing that we care about just the weapon, or is the thing that we care about that we have people who have the power to arrest our children for minor offenses in our schools? And obviously we care about both, but I think we need to think through, because there are a couple of questions in here, right? What are the alternatives? We need to think through, if we are subbing in something else, another type of law enforcement entity for armed police officers, what other problems that are similar are coming up from that?
No, I completely agree. Thank you. Okay, we have another question. What is Baltimore County State's Attorney record on SRO-based cases? Does anyone on the panel have any knowledge?
So the problem, like, we've been trying to get this data. The problem is, because it's juvenile records, they are not going to release it. So we don't have the exact statistics on it. So my information is just anecdotal. So take it with the, as is. I will say that the public defender's office handles, 90% plus of the juvenile cases in Baltimore County. So I think we have a pretty accurate picture. I'm not going to say that the state's attorney out of hand does not dismiss or refuses to consider dismissing school cases. There definitely are instances where they have. I will say that there are several cases in which the facts are not serious, that there is no injury or kind of extenuating, aggravating circumstances where the state's attorneys have insisted on going forward. And my concern with that, beyond what we said before, is that the state's attorneys often say, like, we need to do this in terms of accountability and deterrence. But the reality of the situation is, let's say an incident occurs in November during the school year. That the police file the report, it goes to the Department of Juvenile Services to see whether or not it could be informally adjusted, right? Whether or not that case would be eligible for some kind of diversion. The Department of Juvenile Services sits on that, and then they forward it to the state's attorney's office, and the state's attorney's office has a period of time to determine whether or not they're going to charge it. Then if they charge it, they have to set in and schedule in an arraignment to notify the child and the parent of that hearing. So by the time the kid actually comes to court, it's been about 6 to 8 months since the incident occurred. So you're talking about a 14, sometimes even younger than 14-year-old student for something that happened 8 months ago. You're trying to say, okay, be accountable and, you know, recognize, and this is going to deter you from future like altercations with your former best friend. That's preposterous. What ends up happening is that kid probably gets unsupervised probation for something that happened 8 months ago. We're paying for that supervised probation, and we have to actually ask ourselves, is this necessary? As Michelle and Beth and so many people have been saying, you know, it's over policing, it's over supervision, and it's money that we really don't need to spend.
Thank you, Michelle. Did anyone on the panel have anything to add to that? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. We have someone asked, do you feel SROs profile by race, disabilities, or differences? Separately, do you think offering programs that help with calming like yoga or meditation, etc., would be a good option? Have you considered this?
Go ahead, Megan.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, I think the statistics, again, if we're, you know, looking at the facts and the statistics show very clearly that yes, Black students and students with disabilities are disproportionately arrested. We know, you know, Black students aren't misbehaving any more than white students, but they are being disproportionately arrested. And so in Baltimore County, Black students received 64% of school-based arrests, despite representing 39% of the student population. And the disproportionality for students with disabilities is they're 29% of those arrested and 14% of the population. So that right there, you know, it sort of demonstrates that yes, they are being disproportionately harmed. And I think, you know, the second part of the question is such a great question, because that's sort of the elephant in the room, right? Because everybody is, you know, there is real harm being done here and kids are being harmed. And so what do we do? And I think, again, if you're, you know, really looking at an evidence-based approach, what we do know is that we know that there is a lot of evidence that trauma-informed practices work, restorative justice, restorative practices work, wraparound services, appropriate special education planning and implementation, social emotional learning, and I think earlier somebody mentioned that in Baltimore County, the counselor to student ratio is 250 to 1, and the recommended ratio is 350 to 1. So there's so much room for sort of shifting resources and adding, you know, professionals who are truly trained in working with youth and being positive role models. And, you know, doing restorative practices, and we know that those things work, and there's so much room to sort of focus on that rather than, you know, punitive police who are trained ultimately to arrest.
Thank you, Megan.
I think the other thing that I would add, in particular when we're talking about students with disabilities, is I think the question is, are school police equipped to be able to work with and respond appropriately to the needs that those students have? And so often the answer is no. You know, especially when you are trained as a law enforcement officer, and it takes a long time, and like any professionalization, right? When you're becoming a police officer, you go through the whole academy, you do all of this work. around protecting and serving, around enforcing the law, around like that type of thing, right? And school police officers, I don't know what additional requirements there are in Baltimore County, but as a bottom line, there's a week of training before you are put in a school. And we need to ask ourselves if that is adequate. And I think that the answer is no. I went to 3 years of law school. My sister is in medical school right now, and we could never swap careers and be able to adequately do our jobs, right? And so when you're thinking about who is responding and how are you responding to students with disabilities, do officers have the ability to do that? And I think the answer is no. If we're looking at the way that Megan's client was treated, if we look at the way that the young man who was just killed in Philadelphia just last month was treated in that response, that was a clear call for a mental health response. It is very clear that there is a breakdown between what the fundamental role of a police officer is and what so often we are calling on them to do. And so it's not, and I know we've kept saying this, right? It's not about any individual officer. They're doing good work. They're trying to build positive relationships, and that is true. But when the rubber hits the road, the training that is going to kick in is that of a law enforcement officer and handcuffing an autistic child who is having a behavior that is squarely part of his autism and the reason why he is in this school in the first place.
Thank you, Michelle.
I'm so sorry. Can I step in really quick?
Go ahead, Michelle.
I think the quote of the evening is best quote, where she said like a smile in the hallway and an arrest in the classroom. I thought that was just like so incredibly powerful. And that's exactly right. And the other thing that I will say, and I'm just going to be kind of blunt about it, is, and I think Megan can attest to this as well, a lot of our kids have IEPs, they have special education needs, they have disabilities, and they're high needs kids. These school administrators and these staff members and these teachers don't necessarily want to expend a lot of their resources and energy on these high needs kids who, you know, need all these extra accommodations. And what ends up happening is they look for a reason to take them out of the school, right? They don't want to deal with them anymore. I know that e-learning has now become the norm because of COVID, but before that, any kid who was being suspended or had behavioral issues in the school was being kind of shunted off to e-learning to be homeschooled via a computer. We do not have the kind of robust mental health services, the interventions, the mediations that we need to adequately address the needs of our kids. And when we do have them, they work really beautifully. I think some of our panelists or some of our attendees are pretty well informed about this, but restorative practices, Laurel Smith Bacon is the director of kind of the community conferencing program that goes out to schools and mediates even like major conflicts between students. And they have a 95% plus success rate in getting people to the table and getting them to agree to a resolution that satisfies everybody. That's incredible. That kind of solution is the satisfaction rate far exceeds that what you would get in court. It comes out with like a real tangible concrete outcome. So when we do have those kind of programs, they work, and we just need to fund them properly.
Thank you, Michelle Kim. And I just wanted to add real quickly, when I first started doing this work, I talked to someone in the Baltimore County Police Department who's actually in charge of the SRO program. She told me that there is some training, like very small training that officers get when they become SROs, but that if they have any use of force violations, that is not something that the principal is privy to. And she basically could not say that none of the police in any of the police placed in Baltimore County schools don't have them. Basically what she said is that most police officers do have it on their record. So therefore there are probably some police officers in our schools who have use of force violations on their record, and our principals do not even have access to those records. So I just want people to be aware of that. So not only do they not have training, but some of them also have use of force violations. Okay, let me get back to the questions. I'm gonna do maybe one more question, then we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Okay, are there any resolutions before the Baltimore County Board, oh sorry, I just lost my question, sorry. Are there any resolutions before the Baltimore County Board of Education to remove SROs from public schools? I live in PG County, where we are pressuring our Board of Education to adopt a resolution in this regard. It was voted down 2 months ago and will likely be brought back for another vote in January. I'd love to know what else is happening in the state and how we can collaborate to amplify this effort. Does anyone on the panel have information about, I guess, more information on what's going on the state level?
So the Coalition to Reform School Discipline, a couple members of the panel are members of the coalition. So it's a statewide coalition. And as Michelle Hall referenced before, one of the legislative efforts that's part of a broader police reform effort in Maryland is to remove police from schools statewide. And so we expect there to be sort of a statewide legislative push for that, but there are also lots of different, local movements. There are in Prince George's County, like we talked about, Montgomery County, there's going to be a bill with through the Montgomery County Council members Joando and Reamer introducing a bill to remove police. Howard County, there's been sort of a lot of movement and proposals before the school board. So there's definitely a lot going on and a lot of ways to get involved and to attend, future town halls. I think there will probably be another town hall where students who have been impacted by school police are going to be able to talk, and that's going to be linked to the statewide legislative effort. And so if there's anybody right now who is listening and participating in this town hall who has a story to share or wants to share an experience, definitely reach out to the organizers, because there will definitely be an event coming up sort of statewide to sort of bring the light and elevate voices of students and families that haven't been impacted.
Did anyone in the panel have anything to add to that? All right. I just wanted to read one more comment that someone posted, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up. It says, FYI, most of these SROs police contracts are with the Board of Education or the county council, so people need to contact their own Board of Education member or county council member, depending on the situation in Baltimore County. In PG County, we have to start with the Board of Education. I'm not completely sure. Michelle, you're shaking your head. We have to start with the Board of Education. Okay. So yeah, for people who are looking for how to push this issue forward, the people who are part of the board need to be hearing from you, because, as activists, we only can get so far, but as a community, we all can push a little bit and make our voices heard. Was there anything else that the panel wanted to add before we close? All right, so I just want to thank everyone. I know you all could have been doing anything tonight, so I just want to thank everyone for coming and listening and being educated, so that we can make sure that all of our children are truly free while they're in school. And Melissa, if you wouldn't mind putting back up the, okay, so that's our contact information. Please connect with us on social media. Be on the lookout. This is definitely not the end of this movement. This is just the beginning. So please get connected with us on social media. If you have any stories that you want to share with us or any interactions that you've had with SROs, please give us an email. And I believe that's it. If there's nothing else from our panel. All right, thank you, everyone.